Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Benny Loves You, a very interesting film. Really, I kind of just started to just really have fun while watching this film. Really, at some points in this movie, if people are cat and or dog lovers, this movie may not exactly be for you. Really, there are some gory moments going on to this movie, but I also found this movie to also be kind of very fun, like kind of very like comical, and really we have it to where at some points in time within this film that it kind of reminds me of a lot of very interesting horror movies, like of course Child's Play, like even the more remated remake Child's Play. It kind of feels very familiar territory to that. It kind of also reminds me of things like Puppet Masters and a lot of those kinds of like a child's favorite toy that goes horribly awry out of either jealousy or just really just because something is just there and why not kill it. Going into this movie, I thought it was kind of interesting to have Jack, the main character, seemingly be a toy creator, and it seems that he is just trying to jockey for position. He is trying to figure out what niche thing, what toy that could get him to be able to get to the next rung of his career, as well as Jack has held on to a stuffed uh, toy of sorts that has been Benny for seemingly his entire life. Kind of reminding me of movies also like Ted, but where Ted is to kind of go into very much comedic route and to try to give you a laugh. We end up having this movie who is to just kind of give us a thrill ride to just enjoy. We end up eventually having it to where Benny eventually goes after people that seemingly Jack is to love. And that is kind of a really interesting story. Um, we end up having a lot of the times this Benny character doing a certain sequences of catchphrases, and a lot of times those catchphrases end up perfectly working into a bulk of this movie, which I thought was fascinating. Going into this film, I like it also kind of like bizarrely at some points kind of reminds me of the movie also like Krampus, like the original movie or the first film Krampus, where you eventually have some toys eventually going off to attack people that are in the home. Really, we have it to where bizarrely we end up having a son who ends up having a birthday where his parents both die. And so we end up having Jack now having to figure out a way to be able to afford his house that he has grown up in. And we end up having seemingly Benny going out of his way to help Jack not only try and keep his home, but then also Benny ends up giving Jack some pretty actually decent ideas for new toys to come out. And so we eventually have Jack who ends up just kind of putting up with Benny because eventually it ends up uh, it ends up eventually giving Benny a career success. Whether that ends up being short lived or not, that is what it is because eventually Benny eventually goes after almost every coworker of Jack, but also while Jack is to try to win over people like his boss or like his new coworker slash almost girlfriend Dawn, We also eventually kind of see Benny kind of getting knife happy eventually when someone is to just walk within Jack's home and try to also just sell the home of which he is to live in. Really, I just thought that this movie was really intriguing. I thought it was a real fun movie. I really enjoyed it. Because really, it's just the simple concept of a a toy that you've held for your entire life eventually comes back to haunt you, kind of thing. And plus, we also not only have Jack uh, having this going on to, but then we eventually have certain other kids in this movie that go into the same path as well. But we also have it to where we showcase Jack uh, as a younger kid, eventually getting uh, the origin of how Benny comes to be. So, with that said, I think reasonably, I thought this movie was fun. Let me know in the comments below how you felt about this. If you have seen this movie or you haven't, if it's interesting to you. Reasonably, if you want to go out of your way to finally say that you've seen this film because you actually really want to check this out, go ahead onto an app called, I believe, TV Crush, and you should be able to check this film out. It seems like this film exists on that app currently to the second this recording. Really, I'm sure you could probably go out of your way and probably find this in some location besides that. I'm sure there are probably certain apps or something that eventually could have this film. So, with that said, I think it's about time to go into the coveted spoiler time. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of this film, we are to end up having, of course, like I said, we end up having Jack who is to lose his parents. And eventually he is to have a birthday party where seemingly when Jack comes into the room, both of his parents are seemingly dead. We also have the very, very beginning of this film. Really, we have a girl that is screaming her head off consistently at her mother. It seems like this girl is wanting a certain Barbie or a certain doll of sorts. And so we end up having this childhood toy of hers, which is some kind of bear, telling her that she is special. And so we end up having this girl who is screaming her head off because at first she kind of wants anything that her mother is going to give her. I believe her name is Ashley. And so Ashley's mom is to kind of give her anything just to kind of shut her up, kind of thing. And so we end up having Ashley, who ends up going and like coveting her Barbie dolls and eventually going to sleep to eventually consistently be terrified by a bear of hers that is telling her that she's special, getting to the point of wanting to get close to her and attack her and come out of her closet. We end up having Ashley who ends up chucking this bear into her closet just for the bear to come back and try to get to her. We eventually have Ashley's mom hearing the commotion and is just like, God, like, should I just slap my daughter? Like, we end up having her even Googling it, and it seems like the Google answer is like, well, yeah, like, I belt my kids all the time. It's perfectly fine. And where Ashley's mom is just like, that seems nice. So, that seems okay then. So, we end up having Ashley screaming bloody murder, and we have Ashley's mom who ends up slapping her one just because she's like, God, like, I cannot take this screaming anymore. So we end up having Ashley's mom who thrusts Ashley's bear next to her into bed and walks off and is like, you better not scream one more time. But we end up having Ashley, who ends up, of course, getting taken by this bear, chucked into the closet, and is to, of course, be killed because this bear is to gouge out this girl's eyes and to otherwise kill this girl. So we end up having Ashley's mom, who again is hearing the screaming of her child, and so she ends up going to check what is going on with her child. She can't find her, and so she opens the closet to realize that her child is now dead. So we are to go back to Jack. So the origin of Jack getting Benny. So it seems that Benny had a lot of problems where he thought that there was a demon in his closet, to where we end up having a consistently some demon trying to open a door of Benny's, and eventually we end up having this demon vanish. We end up having Jack's mom, who is to come into the fray and like ask Jack what's the matter, and Jack is to see a demon. And so we end up having Jack's mother, who is to give him Benny, who is to supposedly protect him from anything, from any kind of demons or whichever. And so we end up having Jack, who ends up coveting this Benny because we end up having him uh, feeling like he is protected with this Benny at his side. So, like I said, we end up having Jack, who is to eventually grow up to eventually become this guy who works at this toy factory, who is to put together some kind of sketches and designs to come up with future toys. And so we end up having Jack, who ends up losing his parents. And so now we end up having uh, a house investor guy that is to come into Jack's house to basically say that he needs to sign over this home, and or like they need to put a mortgage out of it onto it, or a lien or whichever. And so Jack ends up going along with this guy, and all while we have Jack also going and spitting in this guy's coffee and giving him some kind of uh, crackers or biscuits that are to have hair and all kinds of things in it because he hates this guy. So we eventually have it to where Jack is forcibly having to decide to grow up at this moment, because we end up having Jack, who is listening to these tapes to try to make him much more of a mature man, whichever. And we end up having these tapes saying, like, hey, man, like, you know what? You're a loser, but you know what? Like, I'm going to help you try to become a winner. And so we end up having Jack, who is listening to these cassette tapes, cassette tapes to try to motivate himself to become this better person, to leave certain things behind. And so we end up having Jack deciding that he needs to leave behind Benny and put it into some sealed container that says rubbish on it. So we end up having Benny, who is to now see of what Jack is really treating him, and so Benny ends up going on the loose. We end up having Benny, who ends up tearing up and knifing out a lot of Jack's teddy bears. And so we end up having Jack, who ends up walking through his home to realize that a lot of his teddy bears that he has had have been knifed and put pasta and to, I guess, show guts and stuff like that, and all kinds of things. And we end up having Jack, who ends up calling the police uh, on the fact that all of his teddy bears had been stabbed and murdered and killed and boiled alive. And so we end up having the police officers going like, oh, okay, we're gonna write down this report, and like we're gonna take it seriously. And we eventually have these cops who are like trying to figure out like who would have done this to Jack's teddy bears. And so we eventually end up having it to where Jack is to eventually find out that it seems that Benny had also taken care of his real estate guy. And we end up having Jack, who is to eventually realize that it seems that this real estate guy had been murdered by Benny. It seems like his body parts and pieces are all over the home, and we end up having eventually Jack scrambling to hide this body because no one would believe that Benny would actually be the actual culprit for killing this man. And because if Jack were to tell anybody that Benny actually did it, no one would believe him. But Jack realizes that Benny had killed this realtor, and so we end up having Jack trying to hide away the body because again, no one would believe that this stuffed doll had killed anyone. So we eventually end up having the cops going and coming to Jack's house to eventually ask him, like, hey, like, it seems like this realtor has been missing. Like, do you have any real true like whereabouts of where you think that this might guy have gone? I think the last time that he was to have been here, and so we're trying to track down exactly where this guy could have gone on to. And Jack is like, well, I don't even know. So we end up eventually having Jack, who is to go to his work, and eventually we end up having Jack realizing how much he's really just hanging by a thread. If we don't have a character who is named Richard, who is bizarrely into Prince to the point of Richard dressing up as Prince bizarrely, we end up having also Jack's superior, who is named Ron, who is heavily into his dog. And we end up having at some points that Jack is kind of scrambling to hide away from his boss because he doesn't have any good, legitimate sketches to give to his boss. And so we end up having Jack, who's trying to hide away from his boss, but eventually his boss eventually ends up finding him into his workplace. And so we end up having Jack, who is brought into Ron's office, and we end up having Ron, who is like, you know what, I feel like I gotta let you go. Because you know what, I don't feel like any of my toy designers would be wearing a Goonies shirt. And Jack is like, I'm not wearing a Goonies t-shirt. Like, if anything, I don't even have a Goonies t-shirt. I have a Gremlins t-shirt. And Ron's like, I don't care about a Gremlins t-shirt. It matters that it's a Goonies t-shirt. And then they're fighting back and forth about this Goonies and Gremlins t-shirt. And I'm like, he's not even wearing that. Like, he's just wearing a generic t-shirt that isn't of any logos of anything. Why are they griping about this? But so we end up having Ron, who's like, well, you know what? I think I need to let you go. But, like, you know what? In all actuality, I think there might actually be a salary job open for you, like, if you want to take it. But you have to, like, come in here and dress more, like, seriously, I guess. So we end up having Jack coming in here the next day to, for the most point, like, wear much more, like, professional, like, attire and stuff like that. So we eventually have it to where it seems that Jack has absolutely nothing to figure out of what is the next thing to like give to Ron. And so we end up having Dawn coming in, who is Jack's coworker, and it seems like she is a much more toy actual like. If Jack is a sketch artist, Dawn actually puts pen to paper and puts the toy together. Like she's actually a technician of sorts to try to put a toy together of whatever they design. So we end up having Ron coming for Jack's sketches, and Dawn mentions it's like, well, hey, like, I actually already took Jack's sketches, and so like reasonably, like we're putting some of his ideas together, and Ron is like, well, good on you, all right, like, nice work, Jack, because really Jack didn't have any sketches whatsoever. He basically just did a drawing of him like getting a noose because like there's no way he's going to be able to make it out of this job, and Dawn kind of covers for him, and so we end up having Jack who ends up going home to eventually find that there is another realtor salesman who ends up walking into his home to have Benny kill him off. And we eventually have a girl who is Tara who is to check out this home, and eventually she is to consistently tell this realtor that, like, you know what, I don't think that this is like the right like, I don't think that this is the right house, babe. Like, I don't think this one like, I don't think that this is the right room, babe. I don't think that this is. And so we end up having it to where Benny is like, ha ha ha, like, I'm gonna go and take these people out. And so we end up having Benny, who ends up ramming a not for sale sign because it was for sale, but he adjusts it to not for sale. We end up having Benny who rams this for sale sign into the real estate buyer, and we end up having Tara who is being chased all around the house, and eventually we end up having Tara who is to have all these images around her when she talks about things, and we end up having Benny who ends up throwing plates at her. We end up having her hiding in some little closet, and then we end up having eventually Tara who ends up going into the attic and hiding out there, and she ends up dropping her phone for her to not be able to call anybody. So we just have, for the rest of this film, we just have Tara who is in the attic because she is so frightened that she does not want to try and leave this attic of fear of death. I thought that that was really funny. Eventually, we have Tara who eventually kind of pokes her eyes or pokes her eye out of the attic from time to time, but eventually she ends up like coming and just staying in the attic for the rest of the movie without saying a word to anybody. So we end up having Jack who is to come home to eventually go, oh, like Benny's been at it again, and so we end up having Jack, who is to again take any body that Benny ends up killing and he ends up just burying it into his backyard. And eventually we end up having Benny, who ends up killing a random cat that is around Jack's home. And so we end up eventually having Jack, who is starting to realize, like, well, hey, like, what if we like actually made a whole series about this of like horror toys where it's where it's a merchandising thing for young adults, to where we can just be like, well, hey, like this seems to be like the new niche market thing to sell to people. So we end up having Jack, who is consistently taking photos of Benny and all these like horror like get outfits as like these rough draft like things for eventually them to make toys out of, and of course they do. to where eventually we have Benny who ends up having a chainsaw or a knife or a something, and they are to try to merchandise these photos, which I thought was really fun. We go along and have Jack, who is just winning over his boss, to the point to where Ron is like, hey, you know what? Like, since Jack is doing so well, I'm going to trust him with my dog. So we end up having Ron, who ends up forcing Jack to babysit his dog for him. And I'm like, yeah, this is kind of the most, kind of honestly, like, horrific moment in this entire movie. We end up having, of course, if we remember the cat moment that I had just mentioned, let's talk about eventually once we get into what happens with this dog. Sadly enough, we end up having eventually Jack and Dawn going and having a date while Jack is also supposed to be watching over this dog. So we end up having Jack, who ends up trying to put Benny in the basement and putting him in some container where he thinks that he will be sealed for good for that day. He gives him his magazine, or he gives him a comic book, and he gives him a light and all kinds of things, and just says like, "Hey, like, stay here for the night, and everything will be good." So we instead, of course, have Benny getting loose, and so while Jack is on his at-home date with Dawn, we end up having Benny, who is to look around in the bottom of this basement. And here's the thing: we end up having Jack, who has way too much weapons in his in his home for a guy like Benny to find. You would think that like Jack would have cleaned out his house eventually when he realizes that Benny is a murderer, but it is what it is. We end up having Benny, who is to look throughout the basement of here, just kind of really contemplating which weapon he should grab onto. And he ends up grabbing this big, huge axe, which he ends up just dragging along with him. Uh, so we end up having it to where Jack and Dawn are having their seemly date, and it seems that Dawn can connect with Jack because it seems that Dawn had a childlike toy that she had, which was, I guess, some old fashioned doll that looks very like dark and disturbing and whichever. We're gonna come to realize that it seems that a lot of people that Jack knows has some childlike toy that they have had for such a long time that eventually will haunt them. Uh, Here's one thing. Before we get to this moment, we also had Jack, who ended up trying to merchandise some disco robot, which I thought was hilarious. We end up having Jack, who was to try and market a robot and call it Raids. But I guess bizarrely, while they were doing the commercial, there was a misprint, or just like the camera didn't fully like zoom in on the whole lettering, and it ends up saying AIDS. And so we end up having Richard, who ends up making a joke about like, ha 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 ha, who wants AIDS? Like, who would sell their kids AIDS? And we end up having Jack, who's like, it's supposed to say raids. It's supposed to say like there's a whole like acronym or whatever that ends up saying raids, but it ends up saying something else. So I thought that that moment was kind of just funny and whatever. So we end up having Dawn and Jack on this date, and we end up having Dawn and Jack just like talking things out, and so we end up having Benny, who ends up deciding to go ahead and just go ahead and just kill off this dog. Sadly enough, we end up having this dog who ends up taking an axe. Sadly enough, and so we eventually have it to where Jack is to eventually realize that Benny is to get loose, and so we end up having Jack, who is to scramble to to not only try and get Benny to behave, But then also we end up having Jack also notice that his boss's dog is dead. And so we end up having Jack, who is trying to scramble to make this dog look like new, even though it's dead. We end up having Jack, who is trying to clean it up and to try to make it look like it's brand new. And eventually we end up having Jack, who ends up trying to put it in some dog bed, thinking that he could come up with some kind of excuse for why this dog just bizarrely just passed away into the arms of Jack. But eventually we end up seeing this dog going and bizarrely flying out of Jack's house to while Ron and his cluster of women are in their car singing some dog song. We end up having, sadly enough, this dog hitting the windshield of their car, and they are just mortified. To where we are to have Ron, who is to just be severely upset that his dog is now dead because he was in the possession of Jack. So we go along here, and so we end up eventually having it to where Jack is really in hot water, and so we eventually have it to where Benny is trying to win over Jack by going into bringing Jack a present. And so Jack is to eventually unwrap this giant present to realize that it is none only than his boss. And so we end up having Jack unwrap the present of his boss. And so we end up having Jack, who is to now basically have it to where Jack can make a decision or two to basically have Benny kill Ron, or really he could just kind of make him grovel and beg and whatever, because of how crappy that Ron had treated Jack over the years. So we end up having Jack taking the low road and telling Ron that, like, okay, well, you're going to tell me that that you're my bitch now, and all kinds of things. You're going to grovel at my feet and tell me that you love me and all of this stuff. And so we end up having Benny, who ends up deciding to go ahead and kill Ron, and really we have it to where Jack has no problem with this. We really have it to where Jack is just like, meh, oh, okay, so I can understand the rhythm and the rhyme now of anybody that ends up saying that they love me. Benny ends up getting jelly and killing them all off. So we eventually have it to where Jack is to eventually go to work one day to eventually have Benny eventually go to his work as well. We eventually have seemingly Benny going and eventually starting to one by one starting to kill off most of Jack's co-workers. We end up having a pen, or we end up having a pencil seemingly going into, or no wait, I think it's either a knife or it's a pencil. I think it's a knife. Not sure. We'll have to tailor back onto that. I think it's a knife. We end up having Benny eventually knife Richard's arm, but he doesn't actually die in this scenario. But eventually we have Benny eventually going through this office and just killing numerous people all over, to the point of us having a massive bloodshed, to where eventually we end up finding out in the very end of this movie that the place of which that Benny had killed all these people is getting repurposed for I guess for children, or some kind of it's some kind of funland or something. It's some kind of it's some kind of kids attraction or something. So we go along to eventually have Jack and Dawn and Richard eventually back onto Jack's home. And I'm trying to rush through this and I'm trying to get through it fairly quickly. And eventually we end up having all three of these people eventually holding on to their children's Esh-like toy. We end up having Richard, who has a robot that ends up turning evil and ends up trying to kill him. We eventually have this robot who ends up taking a vacuum and ends up like basically sucking the body out of Richard and ends up just killing him. We end up eventually having it to where Jack is to try and save Dawn from getting killed, and so Jack ends up taking Dawn and saying that he actually hates her, so that way Benny won't think to get Dawn, even though he actually does love her. And we end up having Dawn who's like, "Oh, you love me," and like Jack is like, "No, I hate you," and she's like, "What?" And he's like I'm doing that for a reason. We end up having him like slapping her and all kinds of things. So we eventually have it to where Benny is to go on a rampage, try and like we end up having Dawn, who is haunted by her doll of choice, and so we end up having it eventually where Dawn ends up successfully taking down her doll, her nemesis, which was her childlike doll, and we end up having eventually where Jack is to put up traps around his home to snare Benny, and we end up having like this Home Alone esque like situation going on with Jack's house where he's trying to figure out a way um, to take down Benny. We end up having Jack who ends up rigging his disco robot to try and take down Benny, but this disco robot eventually ends up failing to where the robot ends up having Benny ends up reprogramming the robot to start to dance, and this disco robot ends up going and just getting killed over. We eventually have Benny, who is also going and trying to find some weaponry as well before he makes it back to Jack's home. Getting stuff like size and all kinds of goofy, like ninja stars and all kinds of things to, I guess, be Benny the Ninja, I guess, and to go after Jack with. So we eventually have Benny trying to get at Jack, going and throwing these ninja stars and size and stuff to eventually only hit I think like the back of certain people's feet, or like it's nothing that would be really significant to hurt anybody. Um, or we end up having these size who end up just kind of just missing Jack at some point. So we eventually end up having it to where Jack is to otherwise try and toss away this Benny, and so we eventually have it to where Benny ends up going through this window, and we end up having the police officers who are seeing this stuffed Benny starting to get closer to them, and so we end up having these police officers who don't even have actual real legitimate weaponry with them are trying to fire like these bizarre looking gun like things. They look more like water guns or something against Benny, and it looks freaking hilarious. To where eventually we end up having seemingly like I think these like pea shooters or whatever the heck that they use ends up eventually getting to the point of impacting Benny to where eventually some of his stuffing eventually ends up coming out. But these like weapons that they're using against him are so piddly and so pointless but it ends up just bizarrely working. So we eventually have it to where they are to, I guess, kill this Benny off, and we are to eventually have seemingly Jack go out of his home to eventually just have these police officers just do exactly what Jack has done in the past, just kind of push everything under the rug because no one would actually believe them. Like the police officers are even mentioning, like, dude, there is no way anyone is going to believe this story. Like, even if we actually had real legitimate proof, there is no way anyone is going to believe us. So we eventually have it to where Jack and Don are to decide to leave this home and eventually just drive off into the sunset. And we end up having Benny, what is left of him, in the back seat to help us understand, well, is Benny still alive? Are they going to do a sequel of this at some point? And so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where both cops just kind of see them off, just kind of like, yeah, no one's ever going to believe this story. And so we end up eventually having to, in the end credit scene of this movie, we end up having to realize that Tara was still in this attic the entire time, to where eventually we end up just seeing her rotting corpse because she just stayed in this attic for so horribly long that that she ended up just like dying of, I guess, starvation, and she ended up just decomposing, which I guess is the end credit scene of this movie. Very interesting film, but also just very bizarre. We end up having also kind of Jack, like giving this monologue towards the end of this movie of just like, hey man, like never ever like throw away your favorite toy because eventually it'll come back to haunt you, kind of thing. And we end up having both this robot and this the teddy bear that ended up killing their children that they've had. They end up kind of coming into the fray, and then eventually we end up like closing up this film. So yeah, like a really fun movie. I really did enjoy it. I think there's probably a scene here and there that I didn't mention. Like I kind of like the fact when we have Jack who is cleaning up the original realtor, where like we end up having like this guy's body parts like all over the house. We end up having a big batch of blood in like in, I think, the kitchen, to where like Jack has to throw a rug over it. We end up having Jack who is to also find like two fingers coming out of the toaster. So Jack ends up tossing the fingers back into the toaster, and we eventually have like this guy's organs and whatever just all over the house. We eventually have this big huge sign on the wall that says Benny loves you, and so Jack has to like put like uh a bloodied artwork in front of it to just kind of just show like, oh no, it's just a part of art. Like I don't know why all of a sudden they have like a bizarrish like bloodied like artwork that is now in the scene of this home. I don't know. But it also just seemed like Don and Jack eventually go on to eventually go and clean up this home and eventually hide the evidence. Eventually, after all of this murder ends up taking place, and the, I guess, cops and or the police officers end up helping them because there is no way that anyone could be convinced that this story is actually true. So yeah, really, I hope I didn't leave anything out. I probably also rushed through a bit of this just because, like, importance of movie and so on and so forth. But maybe every once in a while, maybe, like, if this movie does seem to be interesting to people, maybe I will just eventually go and talk about it again or review it again or something. I don't know. But, anyways, I am going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.